I was 28 years old when I inherited the lighthouse keeper's cottage on the cliffs of Pinegrove Hollow, Maine, 3 weeks after they found my uncle's body at the base of the rocks. The funeral had been small, attended mostly by distant relatives who whispered about how Uncle Thomas had always been strange, how isolation had eaten away at his mind during the 40 years he spent in that cottage overlooking the Atlantic. They spoke about him as if madness were contagious, as if the loneliness of that place had infected him with delusions that eventually drove him over the cliff's edge. I nodded politely at their theories, accepted their condolences, and said nothing about the sealed envelope the lawyer had pressed into my hands after the will reading. The envelope sat unopened on the passenger seat of my rental car as I drove north from Boston, following the coastal highway until the towns grew smaller and the forest thicker. Pinegrove Hollow was not on most maps. The locals in the last gas station I stopped at had given me directions with uncomfortable expressions, as if I had asked them how to reach a place that should remain unfound. The cottage appeared as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, a weathered structure of gray stone and dark timber, perched on the edge of cliffs that dropped 200 feet to the churning sea below. The lighthouse beside it stood tall and white, its light extinguished for decades according to the Coast Guard records. No ships needed guidance through these waters anymore. The shipping lanes had shifted south years ago, leaving this stretch of coastline abandoned to the gulls and the fog. I parked in the gravel drive and sat for a moment, studying the place that would be my home for the foreseeable future. My apartment lease in Boston had expired. My job at the architectural firm had ended badly after I missed too many days dealing with Uncle Thomas's estate. I had nowhere else to go, nothing else waiting for me. The cottage was all I had left. The key turned smoothly in the lock as if the door had been opened recently. Inside, the cottage was exactly as the estate lawyer had described it. Sparsely furnished but clean, with wide windows overlooking the ocean and a fireplace large enough to heat the main room. Uncle Thomas's belongings remained untouched. Books lined the shelves, dishes sat in the cupboards, and a thick layer of dust covered everything like a gray shroud. I set my bags down and finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in my uncle's cramped handwriting, dated 2 days before his death. My hands trembled as I read, "William, if you are reading this, then I have failed. I have broken one of the rules, or perhaps I simply grew too old and careless to maintain the watch any longer. Either way, the cottage is yours now, along with the responsibility that comes with it. I know you will think I was insane. Everyone did. But you will learn the truth soon enough, just as I did when my father left this place to me, and as he learned from his father before him. There are 7 rules you must follow to survive in Pinegrove Hollow. Not guidelines or suggestions, but rules as immutable as gravity. Break them, and you will join the others who thought they knew better. Follow them, and you might live long enough to pass this burden to someone else. Rule 1. Never enter the lighthouse after sunset. The door will be unlocked. You will hear sounds inside. You will see lights moving in the tower. Ignore them all. The lighthouse belongs to something else when darkness falls. Rule 2. Do not answer if someone calls your name from the forest. You will hear your name spoken in familiar voices, voices of people you love or have lost. It is not them. It is never them. Rule 3. Keep the iron bells hung above every door and window. Ring them 3 times at sunset and 3 times at sunrise. If a bell falls silent or disappears, replace it immediately. Do not sleep in any room where a bell has been removed. Rule 4. Never look directly at the tide pools during the dark of the moon. You may walk past them. You may hear things moving in them. But you must not look. What lives in those pools during the new moon is not meant to be seen. Rule 5. If you find objects that do not belong to you placed on your doorstep, burn them before dawn. Do not bring them inside. Do not examine them closely. Do not try to determine who left them. Simply burn them and scatter the ashes in the sea. Rule 6. The fog will come thick some nights, so dense you cannot see your hand before your face. When this happens, stay inside with all doors and windows locked. You will hear footsteps on the porch. You will hear scratching at the glass. You will hear voices you recognize. Do not open the door. Do not call out. Do not acknowledge what walks in the fog. Rule 7. There is a well behind the cottage. sealed with an iron grate and a padlock. Never open it, never look inside, never drop anything down it, and never listen to what might be climbing up from below. If the lock is ever missing or broken, leave immediately and do not return until the next full moon. I know this sounds like the ravings of a madman, William. I know you will doubt, but I am writing this while I am still sound of mind, still capable of rational thought. I have followed these rules for 40 years, and they have kept me alive when others were not so fortunate. Now the watch passes to you. There is more you need to know, details I have documented in my journals. They are hidden in the cottage. Look for the loose stone in the fireplace, third from the bottom on the left side. Behind it you will find 3 leather-bound volumes containing everything I have learned about Pinegrove Hollow and the things that dwell here. One last warning. You will be tempted to leave, to abandon this place and return to civilization. Resist that urge. The Hollow has marked you now as it marked me, as it marked all the keepers before us. If you run, it will follow. The only way to survive is to stay, to follow the rules and to maintain the watch. I am sorry to burden you with this, nephew, but there is no one else. The bloodline must continue. The watch must be maintained. Uncle Thomas. I read the letter 3 times, each reading making my stomach tighten with a mixture of skepticism and unease. This was exactly what the relatives had whispered about. Paranoid delusions, isolation-induced madness, the rambling fears of a man who had spent too long alone with his thoughts. And yet, something in the precise way my uncle had written, the clinical detachment with which he listed the rules, gave me pause. This was not the frantic scrawling of a lunatic. This was the careful documentation of someone recording important information, someone who expected to be disbelieved but wrote anyway. I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket. The sun was dropping toward the horizon now, painting the ocean in shades of orange and red. I had perhaps an hour before sunset, enough time to unpack, to settle in, to decide whether I was going to take any of this seriously. The cottage consisted of 4 rooms on the main floor, a large living area with the fireplace, a small kitchen, a bathroom that had been modernized sometime in the past decade, and a study lined with bookshelves. A narrow staircase led to 2 bedrooms on the second floor, both with slanted ceilings and small windows overlooking the cliffs. I chose the larger bedroom and carried my bags upstairs. Through the window I could see the lighthouse standing stark against the darkening sky. The door at its base was painted red, weathered by decades of salt spray. As I watched, I could have sworn I saw the door swing open slightly, though no wind strong enough to move it was blowing. I turned away and began unpacking, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck that told me I was being watched. By the time I finished organizing my clothes, the sun had nearly touched the horizon. I went back downstairs and noticed for the first time the small iron bells hung above each door and window. They were tarnished with age, each suspended from a leather cord. I had assumed they were decorative, some quaint nautical tradition. Now I understood they were something else entirely. Rule 3 echoed in my mind. Ring them 3 times at sunset and 3 times at sunrise. I checked my watch. 6 minutes until official sunset. Part of me wanted to ignore the instruction, to prove that my uncle's fears were nothing but paranoia. But another part, the part that had felt watched since arriving, the part that had seen the lighthouse door move, urged caution. I moved to the front door and reached up to the bell hanging above it. The iron was cold under my fingers, colder than the autumn air warranted. I rang it once, twice, 3 times. The sound was clear and bright, cutting through the silence of the cottage. I moved to each window and door in turn, ringing the bells 3 times at each location. There were 9 bells in total, and by the time I finished with the last one in the upstairs bedroom, the sun had disappeared below the horizon. The cottage fell into shadow, the last light fading from the sky like water draining from a sink. I stood at the upstairs window, looking out at the lighthouse. In the growing darkness, I could see a faint glow emanating from the tower windows, a pale greenish luminescence that pulsed with an irregular rhythm. Rule 1. Never enter the lighthouse after sunset. I had no intention of entering the lighthouse, then or ever. But as I watched that strange light pulse and shift, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of the red door at the base of the lighthouse creaking open wider, the hinges groaning in protest. I backed away from the window and went downstairs, suddenly desperate for light and warmth. I built a fire in the fireplace using wood from the stack beside it, my hands shaking slightly as I arranged the kindling. The flames caught quickly, driving back the shadows that had begun to pool in the corners of the room. As the fire grew, I remembered my uncle's instructions about the journals. I knelt beside the fireplace and counted the stones on the left side. Third from the bottom. I pressed on it, and to my surprise, it shifted inward with a soft grinding sound. Behind it was a hollow space containing 3 leather-bound books, each thick with yellowed pages. I pulled them out and sat in the armchair closest to the fire. The first journal was dated 40 years ago, beginning with an entry written in a younger version of my uncle's handwriting. Day 1. I have arrived at Pinegrove Hollow to claim my inheritance. Father died 3 weeks ago under circumstances the authorities refused to discuss. The cottage is as he described in his final letter: isolated, austere, and filled with an oppressive sense of wrongness that I cannot rationally explain. He left me 7 rules to follow. I think he was insane. I think this place drove him mad, but I will record everything that happens here, if only to document how isolation affects the human mind. I flipped forward several pages, scanning entries that detailed mundane activities: repairing the roof, replacing rotten floorboards, organizing the study. My uncle's skepticism was clear in every line. He had not believed the rules. He had thought, as I did now, that they were the products of a disturbed mind. Then I found the entry dated day 12, and the tone changed completely. Something is wrong here. I can no longer deny it. Last night I heard my father's voice calling to me from the forest. I know it could not have been him. He is dead and buried in Boston, but the voice was exact, perfect in every detail, down to the slight rasp he developed in his final year. It called my name over and over: Thomas. Thomas, come here. I need to show you something. I stood at the window for an hour, listening, fighting the urge to open the door and follow. Finally, the voice faded, replaced by laughter that sounded like it came from many throats at once. I am beginning to understand why Father seemed mad. The rules are not paranoia. They are survival. I read faster, skipping through entries that documented Uncle Thomas's gradual acceptance of the Hollow's nature. He described the lights in the lighthouse that moved with intelligence and purpose. He wrote about objects appearing on his doorstep: a child's shoe, a bird with its head twisted backward, a photograph of a woman he had never met with her face scratched out. He documented the thick fogs that brought with them sounds of impossible things: footsteps that circled the cottage for hours, voices that whispered promises and threats through the walls. The second journal contained his attempts to understand what Pinegrove Hollow actually was. He had researched the history of the area, driving to libraries and historical societies up and down the coast. What he discovered was disturbing. The lighthouse had been built in 1842 after a series of shipwrecks claimed over 200 lives along this stretch of coast. But the wrecks had not been caused by rocks or storms. According to contemporary accounts that the official histories had buried, sailors reported seeing lights that led them onto the rocks, hearing songs that drew them off course, and witnessing figures standing on the cliffs that vanished when approached. The lighthouse was not built to guide ships safely. It was built to contain something that was already here, something that fed on the shipwrecks and the deaths they caused. The keeper's cottage had been constructed as a garrison, a watchtower to maintain the seal that kept the things of Pinegrove Hollow confined to this small stretch of coastline. The keepers had always come from the same bloodline, passing the responsibility from father to son for over a century. They were not simply maintaining a lighthouse. They were maintaining a prison, a barrier between the world and things that should not exist in it. "We are wardens," Uncle Thomas had written in an entry near the end of the second journal. "Our family has been wardens for generations, keeping watch over a darkness that would spread if we failed. The rules are not arbitrary rules. They are the bars of a cage, and we are the ones who must ensure the cage remains locked." The third journal was the most recent, covering the last 5 years of my uncle's life. The entries were shorter, more concise, as if he had distilled everything he knew into essential facts. He documented patterns he had noticed. The entities grew more aggressive during certain phases of the moon, particularly the new moon. They seemed drawn to specific emotions, especially grief and fear. They could mimic voices perfectly, but they could not replicate physical forms. They could move objects, but they could not cross lines of iron or salt. The final entry was dated the day before his death. I am growing old and careless. Last night I forgot to ring the bells at sunset, too absorbed in my reading to notice the day had ended. By the time I realized my mistake, things were already moving in the darkness outside. I heard the lighthouse door open. I heard footsteps on the porch. But worse than that, I heard the well. For the first time in 40 years, I heard something climbing up from below, the scrape of claws on stone, the sound of breathing that was not quite human. I rang the bells late and the sounds eventually stopped. But I fear I have shown weakness. I fear they know I'm failing. The watch requires constant vigilance and mine is slipping. I do not know how much longer I can maintain this. If something happens to me, if I make one final mistake, I can only hope William will accept the burden. He is young and strong. He can keep the watch better than I could in these failing years. God forgive me for passing this curse to him, but there is no one else. The bloodline must continue. The watch must not fail. I closed the journal and sat staring into the fire, trying to process what I had read. Every rational part of my mind screamed that this was elaborate fiction, the detailed delusions of a man descending into madness. But I could not deny what I had experienced already. The cold bells, the moving lighthouse door, the light in the tower that should have been dark. A sound from outside made me freeze. Footsteps on the gravel, slow and deliberate, approaching the cottage. They stopped at the front door. I waited, my heart hammering, remembering Rule 6. Do not acknowledge what walks in the fog, but there was no fog tonight. The sky had been clear when the sun set. Did that mean the rule did not apply? Or were there other things that walked at night? Things my uncle had not documented? A knock came at the door. 3 slow, measured knocks that echoed through the cottage. William, a voice called. William, are you in there? It is me, Thomas. Let me in, nephew. I need to talk to you, my uncle's voice. Perfect in every detail, down to the slight wheeze in his breathing that had developed in his later years. But Uncle Thomas was dead. I had seen his body at the funeral home, had watched them lower his casket into the ground. William, please. I am cold out here. The fall was terrible, but I survived. Let me in and I will explain everything. I stood up, my legs weak, and moved toward the door. My hand reached for the lock before I caught myself. Rule 2. Do not answer if someone calls your name from the forest. But this was not the forest. This was my front door. Did the same rule apply? I thought about the entry in my uncle's journal, where he had heard his father's voice and resisted the urge to follow. The voice had come from the forest that time, but the underlying principle was the same. Do not trust familiar voices in this place. They are not what they seem. I know you are in there, William. I can hear you breathing. Just open the door. What harm could it do? I backed away from the door, returning to the armchair by the fire. The knocking continued for another minute, then stopped. The voice called out a few more times, pleading, then angry, then silent. Finally, I heard the footsteps retreat across the gravel, fading into the distance. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the fire, feeding it logs to keep the flames high, and read through all 3 journals again. I needed to understand everything, needed to memorize every detail my uncle had recorded. If I was going to survive here, if I was going to maintain this watch, I needed to know what I was dealing with. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to gray to pale blue. When the sun finally broke above the horizon, I went to each bell and rang it 3 times, completing the morning ritual. The sounds that had moved outside during the night fell silent. The sense of oppression that had weighed on the cottage lifted slightly. I made coffee and toast, ordinary acts that helped ground me in normality. Then I went outside to examine the cottage in daylight, to see if the night had left any evidence of its visitation. The gravel driveway showed multiple sets of footprints, more than could be explained by a single visitor. They circled the cottage in overlapping patterns, some prints looking almost human, others showing too many toes or strange elongated shapes. I followed them to the edge of the property, where they simply vanished at the tree line, as if whatever made them had ceased to exist the moment it touched the forest. Behind the cottage, I found the well my uncle had warned me about. It was exactly as he had described, a circular stone structure about 4 feet high, topped with an iron grate secured by a heavy padlock. The lock was old and rusted but intact. I knelt beside it and peered through the grate into the darkness below. I could see nothing, just an absolute blackness that seemed to absorb the morning light. As I stared into that darkness, I heard something that made my skin crawl, a faint scratching sound, like claws on stone coming from deep below, then a voice barely audible echoing up from the depths. William. William, come closer. Just a little closer. I jerked back from the well, my heart racing. Rule 7. Never listen to what might be climbing up from below. I hurried back to the cottage, fighting the urge to look over my shoulder. Inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. I had been at Pinegrove Hollow for less than 24 hours, and already I understood why my uncle had seemed mad to the relatives. This place was wrong in ways that defied rational explanation. The entities here were real, intelligent, and actively hostile. I spent the rest of the morning fortifying the cottage. I checked every window to ensure the locks were secure. I examined the iron bells, replacing one that had a crack in its rim with a spare I found in the closet. I made a list of supplies I would need: more firewood, better locks, iron chains, salt for creating barriers, and materials to repair the aging structure. Around noon, I heard a car approaching on the long dirt road that led to the cottage. I looked out the window to see an old pickup truck pulling into the driveway. A woman climbed out, maybe 60 years old, with gray hair pulled back in a braid and a weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. She knocked on the door, and I opened it cautiously, ready to slam it shut if anything seemed wrong. "You must be William," she said, her voice warm but her eyes cautious. "I am Margaret Thorne. I live about 5 miles down the coast. Your uncle and I were friends." "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "I am sorry, I did not know he had friends in the area. Thomas kept to himself mostly, but we had an understanding. We were both—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Aware of the nature of this place. My family has lived along this coast for 8 generations. We know what dwells in Pinegrove Hollow." I offered her coffee and we sat at the small kitchen table. Margaret studied me with eyes that seemed to look deeper than the surface. "You have read his journals," she said. It was not a question. "Last night. All 3 volumes. And you believe what he wrote?" I thought about denying it, about pretending skepticism. But I had heard my uncle's voice at the door. I had seen the footprints. I had looked into the well and heard what climbed below. "I do not want to believe it," I said honestly. "But yes, I believe." Margaret nodded as if I had passed some kind of test. "Good. Thomas was worried you would refuse the watch, that you would sell the cottage and leave. That would have been bad." "Why? What would happen if the cottage was abandoned?" "The same thing that happened when the lighthouse was decommissioned. The entities here are contained by the structure itself, by the rituals, by the presence of the bloodline. Without a warden, the barriers weaken. Things start to spread. We have already seen it happen once back in 1968 when the keeper died, and it took 6 months to locate his heir. By the time the new warden arrived, 3 fishermen from the village had disappeared. Their boats were found drifting empty, still running, with blood on the decks but no bodies. I felt my stomach turn. My uncle wrote that our family has been keeping watch for generations. But why us? Why does it have to be someone from our bloodline? Margaret's expression darkened. Because your ancestors made a deal. Back in 1842, when they built the lighthouse, something was required to seal the entities here. The first keeper, your great-great-great-grandfather, made a pact. His blood and the blood of his descendants would maintain the prison in exchange for something. The journals do not say what he gained from the arrangement. But the terms were clear. So long as someone of his line remains here following the rules, the seal holds. If the line breaks, if the watch fails, everything contained here will be free to spread along the coast. That is insane. How can something like that be binding across generations? I do not know the mechanics of it, William. I only know that it works. Thomas maintained the watch for 40 years, and Pinegrove Hollow remained contained. His father before him held it for 32 years. The line goes back to the beginning. Your blood is part of the seal now, whether you like it or not. We talked for another hour. Margaret explained that she was part of a small network of families along the coast who knew about Pinegrove Hollow. They did not interfere, but they watched from a distance, ready to help if needed. She gave me her phone number and made me promise to call if anything went wrong. "The rules your uncle left you are essential," she said, as she prepared to leave. "But there are other things you should know. The entities here are bound by certain rules of their own. They cannot enter the cottage unless invited. They cannot cross iron or salt. They grow stronger during the new moon and weaker during the full moon. Fire repels most of them, though not all, and they feed on fear. The more afraid you are, the more power you give them. How do I fight them if I cannot let them inside? You do not fight them, William. You endure them. You maintain the barriers. You follow the rules. That is the watch. Not a battle, but an endless vigil. After Margaret left, I spent the afternoon exploring the property more thoroughly. The cottage sat on about 3 acres of land, most of it rocky cliff overlooking the ocean. The forest pressed close on 3 sides, a dense mix of pine and birch that seemed to lean toward the cottage, as if trying to reclaim the space. I found the remains of a garden behind the cottage, now overgrown with weeds. Near it was a small shed containing tools, spare parts, and supplies my uncle had stockpiled. I also found something else. A boundary line made of iron stakes driven into the ground at regular intervals, connected by iron chains buried just beneath the soil. The barrier formed a complete circuit around the cottage and the lighthouse, creating a protective perimeter. Several of the chains had corroded through, breaking the circuit. I made a note to repair them as soon as possible. If Margaret was right about iron being a barrier, these chains were an important part of the cottage's defenses. As evening approached, I felt my anxiety rise. Another night was coming, and with it another test. I prepared more carefully this time, checking all the locks, laying lines of salt across the thresholds, and building up the fire early. I rang the bells precisely at sunset, watching through the window as the last light faded and the strange glow appeared in the lighthouse tower. The night brought new terrors. Around 10 o'clock, I heard scratching at the windows, dozens of sources moving around the cottage in a coordinated pattern. I looked out but could see nothing in the darkness except moving shadows that seemed to shift and flow like liquid. Around midnight, the fog rolled in, impossibly thick and carrying with it the sounds Margaret had described. Footsteps on the porch, slow and heavy, scratching at the glass, long nails dragging across the windows, and voices, so many voices calling out to me, "William, let us in. We are so cold out here. William, I have something to show you. Come outside. William, your uncle is here. Do you not want to see your uncle?" I sat by the fire, the journals open in my lap, and ignored them all. The cottage groaned under the pressure of things pressing against it, but the walls held. The locks remained secure. The bells chimed softly in the slight drafts, a reassuring sound that meant the barriers were intact. The fog cleared around 3 in the morning, and with it the sounds faded. I allowed myself to relax slightly, thinking the worst had passed. That was when I heard the new sound. A crash from the lighthouse, followed by what sounded like something large moving inside the tower. Through the window, I could see the lighthouse door standing wide open. The green light inside pulsed faster, more urgently, and then I saw something that made my blood freeze. A figure standing in the doorway of the lighthouse, tall and thin, its proportions wrong in ways I could not quite define. It stood there for a long moment, as if looking toward the cottage. Then it stepped back inside and the door swung shut. Rule 1. Never enter the lighthouse after sunset. I had no intention of breaking that rule, but the crash and the sounds of movement continued. Something was inside the lighthouse, something large and active. I could hear it climbing the stairs, hear the metal groaning under its weight. The light in the tower began to pulse in a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code, though I could not decipher any meaning from it. I spent the rest of the night watching the lighthouse, afraid that whatever was inside might emerge and cross the distance to the cottage, but it remained contained within the tower, and when dawn finally came, the light faded and the sound stopped. I rang the morning bells with shaking hands, grateful to have survived another night. The first week at Pinegrove Hollow established a routine that would define my life. I woke at dawn, rang the bells, and spent the daylight hours maintaining the property. I repaired the iron chains, replaced rotted boards on the porch, and cleared brush from around the cottage to eliminate hiding places. I made trips to the nearest town, a fishing village called Merrow's Bay 20 miles south, to buy supplies and maintain some connection to the normal world. The nights were another matter. Each sunset brought a new assault, a new test of my resolve. The entities seemed to probe for weaknesses, trying different approaches to break through my defenses. Some nights they were subtle, whispering at the edges of hearing, trying to lure me into mistakes. Other nights they were violent, throwing themselves against the walls with enough force to make the cottage shake. I learned to recognize patterns in their behavior. The whispers came most often during the waxing moon, growing more persuasive as the moon grew fuller. The violent assaults came during the waning moon, increasing in intensity as the new moon approached. The lighthouse activity seemed tied to the tides, strongest during high tide when the waves crashed against the cliffs below. On the 8th night, I found the first object on my doorstep, a small wooden box carved with strange symbols. Inside was a lock of hair tied with a red ribbon. Rule 5 was clear: burn it before dawn. I carried the box to the fire without examining it closely and fed it to the flames. The hair hissed as it burned, releasing a smell like sulfur and copper. The flames turned briefly green, then returned to normal. The next morning, I found scratch marks on the door where the box had been placed, as if something had stood there for a long time, waiting for me to open it. On the 12th night, I broke a rule. It was not intentional. I had been repairing a section of the iron chain barrier behind the cottage, working later than I should have as the sun dropped toward the horizon. I lost track of time, focused on securing the last stake before darkness fell. By the time I finished and looked up, the sun had already set. I was outside the cottage after dark, alone in the gathering shadows. The temperature dropped immediately, a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn air. I heard movement in the forest, branches breaking, something large approaching through the trees. I ran for the cottage, my tools forgotten in my panic. Behind me, I heard footsteps matching my pace, staying just out of sight. I reached the door and fumbled with the handle, my hands shaking. The footsteps grew closer, faster. I could hear breathing now, ragged and wet, coming from multiple sources. I got the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and engaging all 3 locks. Something hit the door from the outside, hard enough to crack the wooden frame. Then another impact and another. I backed away as the door shuddered under the assault. Through the window, I caught glimpses of shapes moving in the darkness. Tall, twisted forms that seemed to shift and flow, never holding a single shape for more than a moment. The bells above the door began to ring on their own, clanging wildly as if caught in a violent wind. The fire in the fireplace flared up, flames reaching toward the ceiling, and from beneath the cottage I heard a sound that chilled me to my core. The well. Something was climbing up from below, scraping against the stone walls, getting closer. I had broken Rule 7 by implication. I had not opened the well, but I had weakened the barriers by being outside after dark. I had shown the entities that I was fallible, that mistakes could be made, and now they were exploiting that weakness. I grabbed the journals and retreated upstairs, remembering an entry where my uncle had described a similar situation. He had written about a safe room, a place he had prepared for emergencies. I found it in the smaller bedroom, a closet that had been reinforced with iron sheets behind the walls. Inside were supplies, water, preserved food, candles, and a small box labeled "Last Resort." I barricaded myself inside the closet, using furniture to wedge the door shut. The sounds from below grew louder, the impacts on the front door, the climbing thing in the well, and new sounds I had not heard before. Windows breaking, walls cracking. The entities were breaking through, taking advantage of my mistake. I opened the box labeled "Last Resort." Inside was a letter from my uncle, along with a small vial of dark liquid and a knife with a silver blade. "William," the letter read, "if you are reading this, then you have made a grave error and the barriers have been breached. What I am about to tell you goes against everything I have taught you about the Watch, but in extremis, when all else fails, there is one final rule that supersedes all others. The warden's blood is the seal. The vial contains an infusion made from herbs that grow only in the hollow during the dark of the moon. The knife is silver, blessed by 7 generations of wardens. If you drink the infusion and cut your palm with the knife, letting your blood fall to the floor while speaking the words below, you can temporarily strengthen the barriers. But be warned, this comes at a cost. The magic will take something from you, a memory, a year of your life, a piece of your soul. I do not know what exactly, but it works. The words are, "By blood given and blood bound, I seal this hollow and consecrate this ground. Let no darkness cross this line by warden's right and ancient sign. Use this only when you have no other choice. The cost is too high for casual use, but if the alternative is death or letting the entities escape, then pay the price and live to maintain the Watch another day. I am sorry, William. I am sorry for all of this." I could hear them in the cottage now, moving through the rooms below, searching. The thing from the well had reached the surface. I could hear it dragging itself across the floor, leaving wet trails that made the wood creak and groan. They would find the stairs soon. They would find me. I uncorked the vial and drank. The liquid was bitter and burned going down, making my throat feel like it was on fire. I took the silver knife and cut across my palm, deep enough for blood to flow freely. I let it drip onto the floor of the closet while speaking the words my uncle had written. By blood given and blood bound, I seal this hollow and consecrate this ground. Let no darkness cross this line by warden's right and ancient sign. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. My blood hit the floor and spread in patterns that defied gravity, flowing in lines and curves that formed symbols I almost recognized. The symbols began to glow with a pale blue light that spread throughout the closet, then beyond, seeping through the cracks in the door and flowing throughout the cottage. I heard the entities shriek, a sound of pain and fury that made my ears ring. The climbing thing from the well let out a wail that seemed to shake the foundation of the cottage. There was a moment of violent resistance, as if the entities were fighting against the renewed barriers, pushing back against the magic that sought to expel them. Then silence. The sounds of movement stopped. The scratching and scraping ceased. The sense of oppression that had filled the cottage lifted like a weight being removed from my chest. I sat in the closet, bleeding onto the floor, feeling the magic drain out of me along with my blood. The cost came all at once. I felt something tear loose inside my mind, a sensation like pages being ripped from a book. Memories scattered and dissolved. I tried to hold on to them, but they slipped away like water through my fingers. A birthday party when I was 7. My first day of high school. A summer vacation at a lake whose name I could no longer recall. The faces of friends blurred and faded. The details of my life in Boston became foggy and indistinct. When the bleeding finally stopped and the magic released me, I had lost 3 years. Not consecutive years, but moments scattered throughout my life. Holes in my personal history that I would never recover. I knew they were gone, could feel their absence like missing teeth, but I could not remember what had been taken. I wrapped my hand in cloth torn from my shirt and waited until dawn. When the sun rose, I rang the bells and then inspected the damage. The front door had been splintered but not breached. 2 windows were cracked but intact. The worst damage was psychological. Scorch marks on the walls where the entities had touched. A lingering smell of rot and brine, and a feeling of violation that made the cottage feel less like a sanctuary and more like a battlefield. I spent the next week repairing the physical damage and reinforcing the barriers. Margaret came by twice, bringing supplies and asking no questions about the scratches on the door or the haunted look in my eyes. She knew what had happened. She had probably heard the sounds from 5 miles away. "You will make mistakes," she said during her second visit. "Every warden does. The important thing is that you learn from them and do not repeat them. Your uncle broke a rule only twice in 40 years. Both times cost him dearly, but he survived and became more careful afterward." "What rules did he break?" I asked. Margaret hesitated, then said, "The first time was in his 5th year here. He looked directly at the tide pools during the new moon. What he saw there damaged his sight. He wore glasses from that day forward, not because his eyes were weak, but because they had seen something they were not meant to see. The second time was in his final year. He forgot to ring the bells at sunset. You know what that cost him. His life, I thought, but did not say. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. Autumn gave way to winter, and the cottage became a cold fortress against both the natural elements and the supernatural ones. Snow fell in December, covering the ground in white and making the entities' movements easier to track. I would wake to find patterns in the snow, circles around the cottage, lines leading to the forest, and shapes that might have been footprints but were not quite right. I learned to distinguish between the different types of entities. There were the walkers, the tall twisted things that moved through the forest and called out in familiar voices. There were the scratchers, smaller creatures that tested the windows and doors with their class. There was the climber in the well, which I never saw but could always hear on certain nights, making its way up from the depths. And there was something in the lighthouse, something I thought of as the keeper, which had been there the longest and seemed to coordinate the others. During the day, I maintained the property and studied the journals. My uncle had documented over 400 encounters during his 40 years, categorizing them by type, severity, and moon phase. I added my own entries, continuing the record that stretched back generations. I also found something my uncle had not written about in the journals, a journal from my great-great-grandfather, the second warden, hidden in a sealed compartment beneath the floorboards of the study. This journal was older, written in faded ink on brittle pages. It contained information that explained things my uncle's journals had only hinted at. The lighthouse had not been built to guide ships. It had been built to contain something that was already here, something that had existed in this place long before the first European settlers arrived. The indigenous peoples who had lived along this coast had known about it, had built their own barriers and performed their own rituals to keep it contained. When they were driven away, the knowledge should have been lost, but my great-great-great-grandfather had learned the truth from a dying shaman in 1838. The shaman had told him about the hollow, about the thing that lived here, about the price that must be paid to keep it from spreading. 4 years later, after a series of shipwrecks that claimed hundreds of lives, my ancestor had made his deal. The journals did not specify exactly what entity he had bargained with, but the terms were clear. His bloodline would maintain the watch, following 7 rules that kept the barriers strong. In exchange, the entities would remain confined to Pinegrove Hollow, unable to spread beyond the boundaries marked by the iron chains. The lighthouse was built as a focal point for the seal, a physical anchor for the magic that held everything in place. But what happens when the bloodline ends? My great-great-grandfather had written. What happens when there are no more wardens to hold the watch? I have sons who will inherit this burden, and they will have sons in turn. But all lines must end eventually. What then? God help us all if I have not found the answer before my time runs out. He had not found the answer. The journal ended with him still searching, still hoping to discover a way to break the cycle or at least ensure the seal would hold without a warden. Every keeper since had inherited the same unanswered question, and now it was mine. I was 28 years old. If I followed my uncle's pattern and kept the watch for 40 years, I would be 68 when I passed it on. To whom? I had no children, no siblings, no close family except for distant cousins who would think me insane if I tried to explain this to them. Was I supposed to marry, have a child, raise them in this isolated place knowing I was condemning them to the same fate? The weight of that realization settled over me during the long winter nights. I was not just accepting a temporary duty, I was accepting a life sentence, and potentially condemning the next generation to the same. In January, during the new moon, I made a discovery that changed everything. I had been following Rule 4 religiously, never looking directly at the tide pools during the dark of the moon. The pools were located at the base of the cliffs, accessible only by a treacherous path that wound down from the cottage. I avoided them during the new moon, taking my walks along the cliffs during other phases instead. But one morning, the day after the new moon, I descended the path to examine the pools in the relative safety of daylight. The pools were actually a series of depressions in the rock where seawater collected during high tide. During most of the month, they were ordinary tide pools, filled with small fish, anemones, and seaweed. During the new moon, according to my uncle's warnings, they became something else. I approached the largest pool carefully, staying several feet back. The water was clear, reflecting the gray sky above. I could see the bottom, smooth rock covered in a thin layer of sand. Nothing unusual or threatening. Then I noticed something odd. There were marks on the rock surrounding the pool, carved symbols similar to the ones that appeared when I had used my blood to strengthen the barriers. These symbols were old, weathered by decades of salt spray and storms, but still visible. They formed a complete circle around the pool. I examined the other pools and found the same pattern. Each one was surrounded by carved symbols. These were not natural formations. Someone had deliberately carved them here, creating a boundary around each pool. I took photographs and brought them back to the cottage, comparing them to drawings in my great-great-grandfather's journal. The symbols matched. These were binding marks, the same type used in the lighthouse and incorporated into the iron chain barriers. The tide pools were not just dangerous during the new moon. They were prisons, containing something that was allowed to emerge only during the darkest nights. But why allow them to emerge at all? Why not seal them completely? I found the answer in a section of the journal I had previously skimmed over, a technical explanation of how the seal functioned. The entities in Pinegrove Hollow were not simply locked away. They were bound in a complex system of pressures and releases. Certain entities were confined absolutely, like whatever lived in the well. Others were allowed limited freedom during specific times, providing a kind of safety valve that prevented the seal from fracturing under the constant pressure. The things in the tide pools were part of that system. During the new moon, they were allowed to emerge and move freely in their prison. Looking at them during that time would draw their attention, mark the observer in ways that would make them a target. But the rest of the month, they were sealed away. Harmless, it was brilliant and terrible at the same time. The warden's job was not to prevent all supernatural activity, but to manage it, to maintain the balance that kept the seal intact. Understanding this changed how I approached the watch. I began to see patterns I had missed before. The walkers were more active during the waning moon, because that was when they were allowed to test the boundaries. The scratchers came during the waxing moon, following a schedule that distributed the pressure across the entire lunar cycle. Even the thing in the lighthouse had its patterns, its times when it was permitted certain freedoms within its tower prison. The 7 rules were not arbitrary restrictions. They were guidelines for managing this complex system, for knowing when to engage and when to avoid, when to strengthen the barriers and when to let the pressure release in controlled ways. February brought a new challenge: visitors. A car pulled up to the cottage one afternoon, a sedan with Massachusetts plates. A man and a woman got out, both in their 30s, dressed in casual hiking clothes. I watched from the window as they approached the cottage, clearly tourists who had wandered off the main coastal road. I opened the door before they could knock, not wanting the sound to disturb whatever might be listening. "Hello," the man said with a friendly smile. "Sorry to bother you. We are trying to find the Pinegrove Lighthouse. We read online that it is abandoned and open to explorers. Is this the right place?" "The lighthouse is private property," I said firmly. "It is not open to the public." "Oh, come on," the woman said. "We drove all the way from Boston. Just a quick look around. We will not damage anything." "No, the lighthouse is dangerous. The structure is unstable and I cannot be responsible for your safety." The man's smile faded. "We will sign a waiver if that is what you are worried about. We are experienced urban explorers. We know how to be careful." I noticed the sun dropping toward the horizon. They had maybe an hour of daylight left, not enough time to explore and leave before sunset. And they clearly had no intention of leaving easily. "Listen to me carefully," I said, my voice harder than before. "You need to leave now. Not in an hour, not after you look around. Now. This is not a safe place, especially after dark." The woman laughed. "What, is it haunted? Are you going to tell us ghost stories?" "Sarah, let it go," the man said, reading something in my expression that made him uneasy. "We can find another spot." "No, I want to see the lighthouse. We drove 3 hours for this." She started to walk past me toward the lighthouse. I stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "You cannot go there." "Not today, not ever. Leave now or I will call the sheriff." "On what grounds?" "We are not on your property. The lighthouse belongs to the Coast Guard." The lighthouse was decommissioned and deeded to the keeper's cottage in 1973. "I have the paperwork inside. This is all private property and you are trespassing." The man took his wife's arm. "Sarah, he is right. We should go." She shrugged him off, anger flashing in her eyes. "You know what? Fine. Keep your precious lighthouse. Come on, David. Let us get out of this creepy place." They walked back to their car, the woman muttering complaints about unfriendly locals and wasted trips. I watched until they drove away, making sure they actually left. The sun was touching the horizon now, minutes from setting. I rang the bells early that evening before the last light faded completely. As I finished the ritual, I heard a car engine in the distance coming closer instead of fading away. My stomach sank. The sedan pulled back into the driveway just as darkness fell completely. The couple got out looking confused and frightened. "The road," the man said, his earlier confidence gone. "We have been driving for 20 minutes, but we keep ending up back here. Every turn we take, every road we follow, it loops back to your driveway." "What is happening?" I closed my eyes, cursing silently. They had stayed too long. The hollow had noticed them, and now it was not going to let them leave. "Get inside," I said, opening the door wider. Quickly. "What?" "No, we are not. Get inside now," I shouted. "Or stay out there and find out why I warned you." Something moved at the edge of the forest, a tall shape detaching itself from the shadows. The woman saw it and screamed. They both ran for the cottage, and I slammed the door behind them the moment they crossed the threshold. "What was that?" the man asked, his face pale. "What is out there?" "Something you should not have seen. Sit down and do not make any noise." They sat on the couch, huddled together, while I checked all the windows and doors. The locks were secure, the bells intact, the salt lines undisturbed. But I had two guests now. Two people who did not know the rules, who might make fatal mistakes out of ignorance or fear. "Listen very carefully," I said, sitting across from them. "You are going to stay here tonight. You will do exactly what I tell you when I tell you. You will not go near the windows. You will not open the doors. You will not respond if you hear voices calling to you. Do you understand?" They nodded, too frightened to argue. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered. "What is happening?" "Pinegrove Hollow is not like other places. There are things here, old things, that do not follow the rules of the normal world. As long as you stay inside and follow my instructions, you will be safe. When morning comes, you will be able to leave." The night that followed was one of the worst since I had arrived. The entities seemed to sense fresh prey in the cottage. People who did not belong, whose fear was sharp and untempered by experience. The walkers circled the house, calling out in voices that made Sarah cry and David turn pale. "Sarah, come outside. Your mother is here. She wants to see you. David, I have been looking for you. Please, I am lost. Help me." I had warned them not to respond, but it was hard to ignore voices that sounded so perfectly like loved ones. Sarah pressed her hands over her ears, sobbing silently. David sat rigid, his jaw clenched, fighting the urge to answer. Around midnight, the scratchers came, dozens of them based on the sounds. They threw themselves at the windows with enough force to crack the glass. One window in the kitchen shattered, and I had to quickly seal it with boards and reinforce it with iron nails and salt, while the scratchers hissed and clawed at the temporary barrier. "This is insane," David muttered, rocking slightly. "This cannot be real." "It is real," I said, hammering the last nail into place. "And you will accept that reality if you want to survive until morning." The worst moment came around 3 in the morning, when something started pounding on the front door with enough force to make the frame crack. I could hear wood splintering, see the door bowing inward under the assault. The couple screamed, clutching each other. I grabbed the vial of infusion from the safe room and the silver knife. I had sworn not to use the blood magic again unless absolutely necessary, but if the door broke, the entities would flood inside. I could not fight them all and protect 2 civilians who were paralyzed with fear. I drank the infusion, feeling the familiar burn, and cut my already scarred palm. Blood dripped onto the floor as I spoke the words, and the blue light spread throughout the cottage, reinforcing the barriers. The pounding stopped immediately, replaced by furious shrieking from outside. The cost came again, memories torn away. A year of college fragmented and scattered. My graduation ceremony. A relationship whose details dissolved even as I tried to hold on to them. 4 years lost this time. A steeper price than before. I wrapped my hand and sat down heavily, feeling the drain of the magic and the holes in my memory. Sarah and David stared at me with expressions caught between terror and awe. "What did you do?" David asked. "That light. Those words," and I renewed the seal. "It will hold now. You are bleeding. You need a doctor. I will be fine." "It is not the first time." Sarah's voice was barely audible. "Are you some kind of witch? Is this some kind of cult?" "I am a warden. This is my watch, and you should not have come here." We did not speak again that night. They huddled on the couch while I sat in the chair, monitoring the barriers and listening to the entities test the newly strengthened defenses. When dawn finally came, I rang the bells and told the couple they could leave. They practically ran to their car. I watched them drive away, this time successfully navigating the roads that had trapped them the night before. They would tell people about what happened, of course. They would describe the strange man in the lighthouse keeper's cottage, the things they heard in the darkness, the impossible light that had saved them. And no one would believe them, just as no one had believed my uncle or the wardens before him. The world did not want to acknowledge places like Pinegrove Hollow. It was easier to dismiss such stories as delusions or pranks. Margaret called later that day. "I heard you had visitors last night. How did you know?" The entities were more active than usual. I could feel it from my house. "What happened?" I told her about the couple, about using the blood magic twice in one night to keep them safe. Margaret was silent for a long moment. "William, you cannot keep paying that price. Every time you use the blood seal, you lose more of yourself. Eventually, there will not be enough of you left to maintain the watch. What was I supposed to do? Let them die? You were supposed to let them face the consequences of ignoring your warnings. You cannot save everyone, William. And you certainly cannot save them at the cost of yourself. The warden's first duty is to maintain the watch. That means surviving, staying whole enough to continue the vigil. Do you understand? I understood, but I did not like it. The idea of standing by while innocent people suffered went against every moral instinct I had. But Margaret was right. If I kept using the blood magic, kept sacrificing my memories and my life force, I would eventually burn out. And then there would be no warden at all, and the seal would fail completely. March brought the spring storms, violent weather systems that rolled in from the Atlantic with winds strong enough to tear shingles from the roof, and rain that fell in horizontal sheets. The cottage groaned under the assault, and I spent several nights huddled by the fire, listening to the storm and the entities that moved within it. During one particularly severe storm, lightning struck the lighthouse. I saw the bolt from the cottage window, a brilliant flash that illuminated the entire tower for a split second. The light inside the lighthouse flared in response, burning brighter than I had ever seen it. And something screamed. Not a human scream or an animal sound, but a noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A sound of rage and pain that made my bones ache. The next morning, I found the lighthouse door standing open. This had happened occasionally before, but never in daylight. Never when it should have been safe. I approached cautiously, remembering Rule 1. Never enter the lighthouse after sunset. But it was morning now, well after sunrise. Did the rule still apply? I stood at the threshold, looking into the darkness beyond the red door. The interior of the lighthouse was cold, colder than the spring air should allow. I could see the base of the spiral staircase that wound up through the tower, and beyond that only shadows. Something was different. I could feel it. The lightning strike had damaged something, changed something in the balance of the seal. I needed to know what, needed to assess if repairs were necessary. I took one step inside. The cold intensified immediately, and I heard movement above me, something descending the stairs. I backed out quickly, crossing the threshold just as a shape appeared at the bottom of the staircase. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs too long, its joints bending in places they should not. Its eyes glowed with the same green light that filled the tower at night. The keeper. We stared at each other for a moment, separated by the threshold. It did not cross into the daylight, and I did not venture back into the lighthouse. Finally it spoke, its voice like gravel scraping against metal. Warden. It was the first time any of the entities had spoken a clear word to me, something other than mimicry or whispers. I am the warden, I confirmed, trying to keep my voice steady. The seal weakens. The blood thins. The watch will fail. The watch will not fail. I will maintain it. The keeper tilted its head in a motion that was sickeningly bird-like. You are young. You are afraid. You waste the blood on outsiders. You will not last. I will last as long as necessary, and will you? The creature took a step closer to the threshold, testing the boundary. Or will you break as the last warden broke? Will you forget the rules? Will you open the doors you should keep closed? My uncle did not break. He maintained the watch for 40 years. He forgot the bells. He grew careless. The watch consumed him piece by piece until nothing remained but duty and fear. You will fare no better. The keeper retreated back into the shadows, climbing the stairs with movements that defied normal locomotion. Its voice echoed down from above. The dark of the moon comes again soon, Warden. The pools will open. Perhaps this time you will look. Perhaps this time you will see what your ancestors bound here. And when you see, you will understand why the watch must fail. Why it has always been doomed to fail. The door swung shut on its own, leaving me standing in the daylight, shaken by the encounter. That evening, I wrote a long entry in my journal, documenting everything the keeper had said. This was unprecedented according to all the journals I had read. The entities occasionally mimicked speech, but they never engaged in actual conversation. They never acknowledged the wardens directly or discussed the nature of the seal. Something had changed. The lightning strike, or perhaps my repeated use of the blood magic, had altered the dynamics of the hollow. The barriers were still intact, but the relationship between warden and prisoner had shifted in ways I did not fully understand. I called Margaret and told her what happened. The keeper spoke to you? Her voice was tight with worry. William, that is not good. When the entities start communicating, it means they sense weakness. They are probing, testing your resolve. It said the watch will fail, that it is doomed to fail. Of course it said that. It wants you to believe it, wants you to give up. That is how they work. They cannot break the seal directly, so they try to break the warden instead. You cannot listen to them. But what if it is right? What if I am not strong enough for this? Margaret's voice softened. William, every warden has felt that way. Your uncle felt it. My grandfather, who knew your great-grandfather, told me stories of wardens who struggled with doubt. It is natural. The watch is hard. It costs more than anyone should have to pay. But you do not have to be perfect. You just have to be persistent. You just have to keep trying. Keep following the rules, keep maintaining the barriers. That is all any warden can do. Her words helped, but they did not erase the doubt the keeper had planted. I found myself questioning everything. My decisions, my methods, my ability to continue this vigil for decades. I was only a few months into the watch, and already I had lost years of memories, faced death multiple times, and isolated myself from the normal world in ways that felt increasingly permanent. What would I be like after 5 years? After 10? After 40 like my uncle? Would there be anything left of William, the person I had been before inheriting this burden? Or would I become nothing but the warden, consumed by duty as the keeper had suggested? April brought the dark of the moon, and with it a test I had been dreading. The tide pools called to me. I had not looked at them during the new moon, had carefully avoided even glancing in their direction when the moon was dark. But now, after the keeper's words, I found myself drawn to them. The entities had been bound here for generations. What exactly had my ancestors trapped? What was so terrible that it required this elaborate system of rules and barriers to contain? The dark of the moon fell on a Tuesday. I spent the day in a state of nervous tension, arguing with myself. Looking would be a clear violation of Rule 4. It would mark me as a target, make me vulnerable in ways I could not predict. But not knowing what I was guarding against felt like a dangerous ignorance. How could I maintain the watch effectively if I did not understand what I was watching? As evening approached, I made my decision. I would not look directly at the pools, but I would observe them from a distance using a mirror to see them indirectly. It was a compromise, a technical adherence to the letter of the rule while violating its spirit. I positioned myself on the cliff above the pools, lying flat on my stomach with a small hand mirror. The sun had set and the moonless night made the darkness absolute. I could hear the ocean crashing below and closer, the strange sounds that came from the pools during the dark of the moon. Wet. Sliding noises like something large pulling itself across rock. I angled the mirror, trying to catch a reflection of the pools in its surface. At first I saw nothing but darkness. Then something moved and the mirror captured it. What I saw would haunt me forever. The pools were not pools anymore. They were openings, gateways to somewhere else. And from those gateways things were emerging. Not the entities I had been dealing with, the walkers, the scratchers, the keeper. These were something older, something more fundamental. They had forms that my mind could not fully process, shapes that seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could perceive. They moved across the rocks with undulating motions, leaving trails of something that glowed faintly in the darkness. As I watched through the mirror, one of them stopped moving. It turned toward the cliffs, toward where I lay hidden in the darkness. Even reflected and indirect, its gaze found me. I felt that attention like a weight, crushing and vast, an intelligence so alien that its mere awareness of me was painful. The mirror cracked in my hand, a split running straight through the glass. I scrambled backward from the cliff edge, my heart hammering. I had not looked directly, had followed the technical letter of the rule, but it had seen me anyway. The indirect observation had been enough. I ran back to the cottage and locked myself inside, reinforcing every barrier, burning sage and herbs until the rooms were thick with smoke. Outside, I heard new sounds, things I had never heard before. Heavy dragging sounds coming from the direction of the tide pools. Whatever I had seen was coming closer, climbing the cliff path toward the cottage. I spent the night in terror, listening to the thing moving around the cottage, testing the barriers with a patience and intelligence that the other entities lacked. It did not pound on the doors or scratch at the windows. Instead, it probed systematically, looking for weaknesses in the seal with the methodical approach of something that understood the magic that held it. Dawn came with agonizing slowness. When the sun finally rose, the dragging sounds stopped and retreated back toward the pools. I rang the bells with shaking hands and then collapsed, exhausted. I had violated Rule 4, if only indirectly, and now I had attracted the attention of something far worse than the walkers or scratchers. I had seen the source, the things that all the other entities served or originated from, and now those things knew I was here, knew I was watching, knew I was vulnerable. The next weeks were the hardest yet. The thing from the pools did not wait for the dark of the moon to return. Every night it came to the cottage, dragging itself up from the tide pools to circle the barriers and probe for weaknesses. It learned quickly, adapting its approach, finding the places where the iron chains had corroded or where the salt lines had been washed away by rain. I spent my days frantically maintaining and improving the defenses, barely sleeping, eating only when necessary. My hands developed permanent tremors from exhaustion and stress. I lost weight, my clothes hanging loose on my frame. The face that stared back at me from the bathroom mirror looked haggard and years older than my 28. Margaret noticed the change when she visited in early May. She took one look at me and immediately began preparing food in my kitchen, refusing to leave until I had eaten 2 full meals. "What happened?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "What did you do?" I told her about the mirror, about seeing the things in the pools indirectly. Margaret closed her eyes, her expression pained. "Oh, William, you looked. Indirectly, but you looked, and now you have been marked. Can I undo it? Is there a way to make them forget about me?" "I do not know. Your uncle never looked, and his journals do not record anyone who did and survived long enough to document the consequences. You have entered unknown territory. The thing comes every night now. It is trying to find a way in. Then you need help maintaining the defenses. You cannot do this alone anymore, not while being actively hunted." Margaret stayed for 3 days, helping me repair and reinforce every barrier on the property. We replaced the entire iron chain perimeter, upgraded the locks on all the doors and windows, and carved fresh protective symbols on the threshold stones. She also taught me new techniques her family had developed, ways to layer protections that would slow even the most determined entity. When she left, she made me promise to call her every day, just to confirm I was still alive and sane. The thing from the pools continued its nightly visits, but the improved defenses held. It could not find a way through, though, not for lack of trying. I adapted to a new routine. Sleep during the day in shifts, stay alert all night, maintain constant vigilance. It was exhausting and unsustainable, but I had no choice. In June, something unexpected happened. The thing stopped coming. For 3 nights in a row, the sunset passed without the familiar dragging sounds approaching from the tide pools. I remained alert, suspicious of this change, but night after night the silence continued. The other entities still came, the walkers, the scratchers, the various things that tested the barriers, but the thing from the pools was absent. On the 4th night, I found out why. I was checking the perimeter before sunset when I noticed something at the edge of the iron chain barrier. A figure stood just outside the protective circle, perfectly still, watching the cottage. As I approached cautiously, I realized it was not one of the entities. It was a person, a woman maybe in her 50s, dressed in practical hiking clothes. "Stay back," I called out. "This is private property." The woman did not move or respond. She simply stood there, staring at me with eyes that reflected the setting sun like mirrors. My stomach dropped. This was not a lost tourist. This was something else, something new. "You are not human," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The woman smiled, and the expression was wrong, too wide, revealing too many teeth. "I am as human as you are, Warden. I was born in Portland, lived in Chicago, died in a car accident on Route 1 5 years ago. Now I am here, serving new masters, speaking their words." A hollow. The entities had possessed a corpse, animating it to serve as an emissary. "What do you want?" "To deliver a message from the things below. They have been patient for generations, waiting for the watch to weaken. You have shown them that weakness. You looked when you should have remained blind. You have bled your strength into the barriers. You are failing, William, just as your uncle failed. And when you fall, they will be free. The watch will not fail. I will maintain it." The hollow smile widened further, splitting the skin at the corners of its mouth. "You cannot maintain it forever. You are one person alone, fighting an enemy that never tires, never stops, never dies. How long can you last? Another year? 5 years? You will make another mistake. You will have another moment of weakness. And in that moment, we will be there. If you are so confident, why send a messenger? Why not just wait for me to fail? Because the things below have grown impatient. They offer you a choice, a way out that your ancestors never had. Abandon the watch. Leave Pinegrove Hollow. The entities will remain here, confined to this place. You will be free to live your life, to leave this burden behind. And what happens to everyone else along this coast? What happens when the seal fails without a warden? That is not your concern. You did not create this prison. You should not be required to maintain it. The sins of your ancestors are not yours to bear. It was tempting, a poisonous kind of temptation. The Hollow was right. I had not chosen this responsibility. It had been thrust upon me by an ancestor's decision made nearly 2 centuries ago. Why should I sacrifice my life, my memories, my sanity, for a deal I never agreed to? But I thought about Grand Island, about the families living unaware of what crouched at the edge of their reality. I thought about the fishing villages along the coast, about Margaret and people like her who knew the truth and trusted the watch to hold. I thought about my uncle who had maintained this vigil for 40 years despite the cost. No, I said, I will not abandon the watch. The Hollow's expression shifted, the false smile fading. Then you are a fool. You will die here alone and forgotten, having wasted your life on a duty no one will thank you for. Your sacrifice will be meaningless, perhaps, but I will make it anyway. The Hollow stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked into the forest, its movements jerky and unnatural. I watched until it disappeared among the trees, knowing I had just crossed another threshold. The entities were no longer content to wait for me to fail. They were actively trying to break my resolve, to make me abandon my post willingly. That night, the siege intensified. Every entity in the Hollow converged on the cottage simultaneously, a coordinated assault that tested every barrier at once. The walkers surrounded the house, calling out in a dozen different voices. The scratchers threw themselves at the windows with renewed fury. The thing from the pools returned, dragging itself up to press against the walls with a weight that made the entire structure groan. And from the lighthouse, the keeper emerged for the first time since I had seen it in the doorway, standing at the edge of the protective circle and watching with those burning green eyes. I moved through the cottage in a state of controlled panic, reinforcing barriers as they weakened, burning herbs to drive back the entities that pressed too close, ringing bells when the sounds grew overwhelming. The assault lasted until dawn, 6 hours of relentless pressure that left me shaking and exhausted. When the sun rose and the entities retreated, I surveyed the damage. 2 windows had cracked under the strain. The front door had deep gouges in the wood. Several sections of the iron chain barrier had been pulled loose from the ground. The cottage had held, but barely. I spent the entire day repairing the damage, working until my hands bled and my muscles screamed. I could not afford another night like that. The barriers would not survive a second assault of that intensity. As I worked, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The protective symbols carved into the threshold stones were beginning to fade, worn away not by time or weather, but by something else. The magic itself was weakening, eroded by the constant pressure from the entities and my repeated use of the blood seal. The keeper had been right. The watch was failing, not because I was weak or incompetent, but because the system itself was unsustainable. Each generation of wardens had depleted the seal a little more, using emergency measures that borrowed against future strength. My uncle had used the blood magic. His father before him had probably done the same. And now I was continuing the pattern, each use bringing the inevitable collapse closer. I sat on the porch steps as the sun began to set, staring at the lighthouse and wondering if I was fighting a losing battle. How many more nights could I survive? How many more times could I use the blood seal before there was nothing left of me? And even if I lasted, what would I be passing on to the next warden? A seal so weakened that they would face immediate failure. The thought of surrender whispered at the edges of my mind. The Hollow had offered an escape. I could leave, return to the normal world, let someone else deal with this impossible burden. But who? There was no one else. I was the last of the bloodline willing to maintain the watch. If I left, the seal would collapse within months, maybe weeks, and everything contained here for nearly 2 centuries would be free to spread. No, I could not leave, but I could not continue this way either. I needed a different approach, a way to strengthen the seal permanently rather than just patching it with temporary measures. The answer had to exist somewhere in the accumulated knowledge of 6 generations of wardens. I just had to find it. I spent the next week immersed in the journals, reading every entry from every warden, looking for patterns, for techniques I had missed, for anything that might help. I neglected the physical maintenance of the property, focusing entirely on research. The entities seemed to sense my distraction and grew bolder, testing the barriers every night with increasing aggression. On the 8th day, I found something in my great-great-grandfather's journal, buried in a technical section I had skimmed over before. He had discovered that the seal could be strengthened not just through blood magic, but through a ritual that required 3 components: warden's blood, iron from the lighthouse, and seawater collected during a specific astronomical alignment. The seal weakens because we treat it as a barrier, he had written, a wall to hold back the darkness. But it is not a wall. It is a living thing, a symbiotic relationship between warden and land. It must be fed, nurtured, renewed. The blood magic is emergency measure, a bandage on a wound. The renewal ritual is surgery, a fundamental repair of the underlying structure. He had performed the ritual once during his 20th year as warden, when he noticed the barriers beginning to fail. The results had been dramatic. The entities had retreated for an entire year afterward, and the seal had remained strong for decades. But the ritual came with risks. It required the warden to enter the lighthouse during the dark of the moon, to climb to the lamp room where the keeper dwelt, and to perform the renewal at the exact moment of a specific celestial alignment. The danger was not just from the keeper, but from the ritual itself. Strengthening the seal meant binding yourself more deeply to it, making your life force an even more integral part of the barrier. I am now inseparable from Pinegrove Hollow, my great-great-grandfather had written after performing the ritual. I can feel the entity's movements as if they walk across my own skin. I know when the barriers weaken, as if feeling pain in my own body. The watch is no longer something I do. It is something I am. This is the true price of the renewal. You become the seal. I read the passage over and over, trying to understand the implications. My great-great-grandfather had lived another 30 years after performing the ritual, maintaining the watch successfully until his death. But at what cost? What did it mean to become the seal? To be so fundamentally bound to this place that you could never truly leave? And yet, what choice did I have? The current approach was failing. I could keep patching the barriers with blood magic, losing more of myself with each use until there was nothing left. Or I could perform the renewal, bind myself permanently to Pinegrove Hollow, but give the seal the strength to last another generation. The next dark of the moon was 3 weeks away. I had that long to prepare, to gather the materials needed and to make peace with what I was about to do. I called Margaret and told her what I had found. She was silent for a long time after I finished explaining. Finally, she said, "William, do you understand what you are considering? Your great-great-grandfather was never the same after the renewal. My grandfather told me stories. He said the old warden could sense things no human should be able to sense, knew things he had no way of knowing. He was more than human, but also less. Part of him had merged with something ancient and inhuman. I know, but I see no other option. The seal is failing. This is the only way to repair it. There might be another way. We could try to find other members of your family, other descendants of the bloodline. If we could share the burden among multiple wardens, there is no time for that. And I have no siblings, no children. My father was an only child. Uncle Thomas was my only close relative with the bloodline. The family tree has narrowed to almost nothing." Margaret sighed. "Then I suppose you have no choice. But William, promise me something. Promise me you will document everything. If this works, future wardens need to know. If it does not work, well, someone needs to know what happened to you," I promised. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. I gathered iron filings from the lighthouse, scraping rust from the ancient structure and collecting it in a glass jar. I studied the astronomical charts, calculating the exact moment when the alignment would occur. I prepared my body and mind, eating better, sleeping more, trying to build up my strength for what was coming. The entities seemed to sense something was changing. Their nightly assaults grew more desperate, more violent. The thing from the pools came every night now, accompanied by the keeper and dozens of lesser entities. They threw themselves at the barriers with suicidal intensity, as if they knew they were running out of time. On the night before the dark moon, Margaret arrived with supplies and moral support. She helped me make final preparations, checking and double-checking every detail of the ritual. "Are you frightened?" she asked as we sat by the fire that evening. "Terrified," I admitted, "but more frightened of what happens if I do nothing. Your uncle would be proud of you. He always hoped you would accept the watch, but he worried you would not have the strength for it. He was wrong. You are stronger than he ever was." I was not sure about that, but I appreciated her words. We did not sleep that night. We sat together, talking about ordinary things, trying to pretend this was just a normal evening. When dawn came, Margaret hugged me tightly. "Be careful in there," she said. "The lighthouse is the keeper's domain. It will not let you perform the ritual without a fight." "I know." She left before the sun fully rose, driving away with a final wave. I watched her go, wondering if I would ever see her again. The day of the dark moon was overcast and cold, with a wind that came off the ocean carrying the smell of storms. I spent the hours reviewing the ritual steps, memorizing every word and gesture. The timing had to be precise. The alignment would occur at precisely 11 minutes after midnight. I would have a window of less than 5 minutes to complete the ritual. As evening approached, I gathered the materials: the jar of iron filings, a vial of my own blood drawn that morning, a container of seawater collected during the previous alignment 6 months ago, and the silver knife from my uncle's supplies. I also brought a flashlight, though I suspected it would not work inside the lighthouse at night. The sun set at 18 minutes after 7. I rang the bells, performing the evening ritual one last time as the warden I currently was. When I emerged from this night, if I emerged, I would be something different. I waited until midnight, watching the clock with growing tension. The entities gathered outside as always, but tonight they seemed different, quieter, watchful, as if they knew what was coming and were waiting to see if I would actually go through with it. At 5 minutes before midnight, I left the cottage and walked toward the lighthouse. The entities did not attack, they simply watched, a silent audience of twisted forms and glowing eyes. The keeper stood at the base of the lighthouse, its elongated form blocking the red door. "You should not enter, Warden," it said, its grinding voice carrying across the distance. "What waits inside will break you. Move aside, I cannot. This is my domain. I am bound to guard this threshold. Then I will go through you." I drew the silver knife. The keeper hissed but stepped aside. Apparently it could impede but not actually prevent the warden from entering. I grasped the handle of the red door, felt the cold metal burn my hand, and pulled it open. The interior of the lighthouse was impossibly vast, a space that could not exist within the physical structure I had seen from outside. The walls stretched upward into darkness, and the spiral staircase seemed to ascend forever. The green light that I had seen from outside came from everywhere and nowhere, casting 6 shadows that moved independently of any light source. I began to climb. Each step felt like lifting a great weight, as if gravity itself was trying to prevent my ascent. The air grew colder as I climbed, until my breath came out in clouds and frost formed on the railing. I counted the steps, trying to track my progress, but lost count somewhere after 300. The lighthouse tower should have been no more than 80 feet tall, but I climbed for what felt like hours. Things moved in the darkness beyond the stairs. I caught glimpses of forms that hurt to look at, heard whispers in languages that predated human speech. The lighthouse was not just a prison. It was a crossroads, a place where multiple realities intersected, and the stairs I climbed existed in more than one dimension at once. Finally, I reached a door. Not the lamp room I expected, but a simple wooden door set into the curved wall of the tower. It stood slightly ajar, green light spilling through the crack. I pushed it open and stepped through. The room beyond defied description. It was circular like the tower, but the walls were covered in the same symbols I had seen carved around the tide pools, around the cottage, along the iron chain barrier. These symbols glowed with inner light, pulsing in rhythm with something I could not identify. In the center of the room stood a pedestal made of black stone, and on the pedestal rested an hourglass filled with what looked like blood. The hourglass was the seal. I understood that immediately and instinctively. The blood inside represented the life force of all the wardens who had maintained the watch, going back to the first one. As time passed, the blood drained from the upper chamber to the lower one, and when it was empty, the seal would fail completely. The upper chamber was nearly empty. Maybe a quarter of the blood remained. At the current rate, the seal would fail within 5 years, 10 at most. I checked my watch, 4 minutes until the alignment. I set out the materials, arranged them according to the instructions in the journal, and prepared myself for what had to be done. The ritual was complex but clear. I had to combine the 3 materials, iron, blood, and seawater, while speaking the words of renewal. Then I had to pour the mixture into the hourglass, adding my life force to the accumulated power of all previous wardens. At precisely 11 minutes after midnight, I felt the alignment click into place. The symbols on the walls blazed brighter, and the hourglass began to hum with a sound just below the threshold of hearing. I mixed the materials in a small bowl, speaking the words my great-great-grandfather had recorded. By iron forged and blood bound, by water deep and earth around, I seal this hollow and renew this ground. My life to the watch, my strength to the seal, my blood to the barrier that must not yield. The mixture in the bowl began to glow, first red like blood, then silver like iron, then blue-green like ocean water. I lifted the bowl and poured the contents into the hourglass. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The hourglass absorbed the mixture, and the level in the upper chamber rose dramatically. But more than that, I felt something inside me tear loose and flow into the glass along with the mixture. Not just blood or memories, but something more fundamental. My life force, my essence, my very self was being drawn into the seal. I tried to pull back, but the ritual had already begun and could not be stopped. I felt myself being pulled forward. My hands pressed against the hourglass, and through it, I suddenly perceived everything. I could feel every entity in Pinegrove Hollow, sense their locations and intentions as clearly as feeling my own limbs. I could feel the barriers, the places where they were strong and where they were weak. I could feel the tide pools and the things that waited in them, patient and ancient. I could feel the well and the thing that climbed eternally from its depths. I could feel the keeper in the lighthouse tower, separate from me but also connected, both prisoner and fellow guardian. And beyond the hollow, I could feel the normal world, the people living their lives unaware of what crouched at the edge of their reality. I felt Margaret in her house 5 miles down the coast, felt her worry and her hope. I felt the town of Marrow's Bay, the fishermen preparing their boats, the families sleeping peacefully. All of this depended on the seal. On me. The connection stabilized, and I found myself still standing in the impossible room, still pressing my hands against the hourglass. But I was changed. Part of me was now inside the glass, merged with the seal itself. I was still William, still human, but I was also something more. I was the warden, capitalized and absolute, not just performing a duty, but embodying it. I removed my hands from the hourglass and stepped back. The blood in the upper chamber had risen to 3/4 full, enough to maintain the seal for at least another century, maybe 2. The next warden would have time to learn, to grow strong, to prepare for their own renewal if necessary. If there was a next warden. I still had no heir, no one to pass this burden to when my time came, but that was a problem for another day. For now, the seal was renewed, and the watch would continue. I made my way back down the stairs, which seemed shorter now, as if the lighthouse had accepted my presence and no longer needed to test me. The keeper waited at the bottom, its green eyes studying me with what might have been respect or might have been resignation. "You did it," it said. No longer a question. "You renewed the seal. You are bound now, warden. Truly bound I am. Then I acknowledge you. You are no longer just an inheritor of the watch. You are the watch. We are bound together now, you and I and all the others, prisoners and wardens in the same cage." I stepped past it and out into the night. The entities still surrounded the lighthouse, but their demeanor had changed. They no longer tested the barriers or called out in false voices. They simply watched, acknowledging the shift in power that had occurred. I walked back to the cottage, feeling the renewed strength of the seal in every step. The barriers were solid again, stronger than they had been since my uncle's early years. The entities could sense it too. I felt their frustration and grudging acceptance through the connection the ritual had created. Inside the cottage, I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted but triumphant. I had done what needed to be done. The watch would continue. Pinegrove Hollow would remain contained. But I had paid the price my great-great-grandfather had warned about. I was no longer fully human, no longer entirely William. I was the warden, bound to this place in ways that went beyond duty or choice. I would never truly leave here even if I physically departed. Part of me would always remain in the hourglass, in the seal, in the lighthouse on the cliffs. I slept for 18 hours, the first deep sleep I had experienced since arriving at Pinegrove Hollow. When I woke, the sun was high and the cottage felt different, lighter, safer. The shadows that had lurked in the corners were gone, driven back by the renewed seal. The sense of oppression that had hung over the property had lifted. I went outside and found the iron chain barriers glowing faintly in the sunlight, a shimmer that I suspected only I could see. The protective symbols on the threshold stones were fresh and clear, renewed by the ritual's magic. Even the air felt different, cleaner somehow, as if the infection had been purged. Margaret called that afternoon. "I felt it," she said without preamble. "Last night, around midnight, something changed. The entities, the sense of wrongness, all of it pulled back." "What did you do?" "I performed the renewal ritual. The seal is strengthened. It should hold for another century at least. And what did it cost you?" I thought about how to answer that. Everything and nothing. I'm still myself, but I am also the seal now. I can feel the hollow in ways I could not before. I sense the entities, know when they move, understand their patterns. I am more effective as a warden now, but I am also trapped here in ways that go beyond physical presence. Can you leave? If you wanted to visit the city, take a vacation, could you? Physically, yes, but I would feel every fluctuation in the seal, every test against the barriers. I would sense if something went wrong. I do not think I could travel far or stay away long without feeling wrong, incomplete. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry, William. That is a heavy burden for anyone to carry. It is the burden my ancestors accepted when they made their deal. I am just continuing what they started." We talked for a while longer, and she promised to visit more often, to help maintain the social connection that would keep me grounded in humanity. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and began a new journal, the first entry as the renewed warden. "Day 1 of the second watch," I wrote. "The seal is renewed. I'm changed but whole. The entities remain contained. The vigil continues. The weeks and months that followed established a new pattern. The nightly assault stopped almost entirely. The entities still moved at the edges of the property, still tested the occasional barrier, but without the desperate intensity they had shown before. They knew the seal was strong again, and they adapted their behavior accordingly. I developed my new abilities, learning to sense the entities with increasing precision. I could tell when the walkers emerged from the forest without seeing them. I could feel the thing in the well beginning its nightly climb and track its progress by the disturbance it created in the seal. I could even sense the keeper's movements in the lighthouse, though it no longer emerged to confront me directly. The most surprising development was my relationship with the tide pools. During the dark of the moon, I could feel the things that emerged from them without looking. They were older than the keeper, older than the walkers, older perhaps than the hollow itself. They were remnants of something that had existed before human concepts of reality had solidified. Entities from a time when the boundaries between worlds were more fluid. They had been trapped here by accident, I came to understand. When the first warden created the seal, he had intended to contain only the things that were actively threatening the coast. But the seal had been too effective, too comprehensive. It had caught everything supernatural in the area, including entities that had been mostly harmless. Now they were all prisoners together, malevolent and benign alike, bound by a magic none of them could break. This knowledge changed how I viewed the watch. I was not just a jailer keeping dangerous things locked away. I was also maintaining a mistake, perpetuating a prison that held innocent entities along with guilty ones. But there was no way to selectively release prisoners. The seal worked as a whole or not at all. If I tried to free the harmless entities, the dangerous ones would escape as well. It was a moral complexity my uncle's journals had never addressed. Perhaps because he had never connected with the seal deeply enough to understand it. Or perhaps he had understood and simply chosen not to dwell on the ambiguity. After all, the primary duty of the warden was clear: contain everything, protect the outside world, maintain the watch. Questions of justice for the imprisoned entities were secondary to that imperative. Summer turned to autumn, and I marked my first year at Pinegrove Hollow. I was 29 years old now, though I felt much older. The watch had aged me in ways that went beyond years. My hair had developed gray streaks at the temples. Lines had appeared around my eyes from constant vigilance. My hands bore scars from the blood magic and the renewal ritual, permanent marks of my connection to the seal. But I had survived. I had learned. And I had strengthened the seal enough to give the next warden a chance. The question of succession weighed on me increasingly. I needed to find an heir, someone to train, someone who could take over the watch when I could no longer maintain it. But who? I had no children, no close relatives except distant cousins who knew nothing of the Hollow. In October, Margaret brought a suggestion. "There is a girl in Melrose Bay," she said over coffee in my kitchen. "She is 17, about to graduate high school. Her name is Rebecca and she has the sight." "The sight?" "She can see things that others cannot. Spirits, hauntings, supernatural phenomena. Her family thinks she is troubled, maybe mentally ill. But I know what she actually has. It is a gift, and a dangerous one without proper training." "What does this have to do with me?" "She is not of your bloodline, so she cannot be the warden. But she could be trained as an assistant, someone to help you maintain the watch. And perhaps more importantly, she could learn the knowledge, become a repository of information in case something happens to you before you find a proper heir." The idea had merit. Having someone else who understood the Hollow, who could help with the daily maintenance and provide backup during emergencies, would make the watch more sustainable. And if Rebecca had genuine supernatural sensitivity, she might be able to learn faster than someone coming in completely blind. "Bring her," I said. "Let me meet her. If she seems suitable, we can discuss training." Margaret brought Rebecca to the cottage 2 weeks later on a crisp November afternoon. The girl was small and thin, with dark hair and enormous eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She looked at the cottage, then at the lighthouse, and I saw recognition in her expression. "This place is wrong," she said immediately. "Not bad exactly, but twisted, like reality is thinner here. You can sense that?" I asked. I have always been able to sense things like this. Places where the normal world does not quite hold. I just never knew what to do about it. We sat in the living room and I explained the basics of Pinegrove Hollow, the entities, the seal, the watch. Rebecca listened with an intensity that reminded me of myself a year ago, when I first read my uncle's journals. But where I had struggled with disbelief, she simply accepted everything I said. "I knew places like this existed," she said when I finished. "I have felt them before, though never one this strong. The things here, are they dangerous?" "Very. They are contained by the seal and the barriers, but they would kill without hesitation if given the opportunity." "And you maintain all of this alone?" "Yes, it is exhausting." Rebecca looked around the cottage, her eyes pausing on the iron bells, the protective symbols, the careful arrangements I had made to keep the entities at bay. "You need help," she said simply. "Teach me. I want to learn." And so I gained an apprentice. Rebecca visited the cottage 3 times a week at first, increasing to 5 times as her knowledge grew. She proved to be a quick study, absorbing information with remarkable speed. I taught her the rules, the rituals, the history of the Hollow. She learned to sense the entities, to distinguish between the walkers and scratchers and the other things that moved at the edges of the property. She could not perform the blood magic that required warden's blood, the specific bloodline that bound the seal, but she could maintain the physical barriers, repair the iron chains, mix the protective herbs, and keep watch during the day so I could sleep more than a few hours at a time. Having her assistance changed everything. For the first time since inheriting the watch, I felt like the burden might be manageable. I could take breaks, could focus on research while she handled routine maintenance. The constant exhaustion that had defined my first year began to ease. Rebecca also brought news from the outside world, stories from Melrose Bay and the surrounding area. Through her, I maintained my connection to normal society, stayed grounded in the reality beyond Pinegrove Hollow. She became not just an apprentice but a friend, someone who understood the weight of what I carried because she shared part of it. In December, during a particularly heavy snowstorm, Rebecca stayed overnight at the cottage for the first time. We sat by the fire while the wind howled outside and the entities prowled in the darkness, kept at bay by the barriers but audible in the storm. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Taking on the watch?" I thought about the question carefully. Regret implies I had a real choice. I could have refused, could have sold the cottage and walked away. But knowing what I know now, Knowing what would have been released if the watch had failed, I do not think I could have lived with that guilt. So you are here out of duty? Duty, yes, but also something else. This place, as terrible as it is, has become mine in ways I cannot fully explain. I am connected to it, responsible for it. It is not just my duty. It is my purpose, Rebecca nodded slowly. I think I understand. I have always felt like I was supposed to do something important, something that used my abilities in a meaningful way. Maybe this is what I was meant for. Not to be the warden, but to be part of the watch in my own way. We talked late into the night, and I realized how grateful I was for her presence. The loneliness that had threatened to crush me during my first months at the Hollow had been alleviated by having someone who understood, someone who shared the vigil. As my second year at Pinegrove Hollow progressed, I began to notice changes in the entities themselves. They were adapting to the renewed seal, finding new ways to exist within its constraints. The walkers moved differently, more cautiously, as if learning from their failed attempts to breach the barriers. The Scratchers developed new tactics, testing the defenses at unexpected times. Most concerningly, the thing from the pool seemed to be growing. Each time it emerged during the dark of the moon, I sensed it was larger, more powerful, as if feeding on something I could not identify. It still could not break through the barriers, but the ease with which it had been contained before was diminishing. I documented all of this in my journal, adding to the accumulated knowledge that future wardens would need. I also began teaching Rebecca everything I knew, treating her as the custodian of this information in case something happened to me before I could find a true heir. "What if you cannot find someone from your bloodline?" she asked one afternoon as we repaired a section of the iron chain barrier. "What if you are the last? Then I will maintain the watch as long as I can, and hope that the seal holds long enough after I am gone for someone to figure out a solution. That is not much of a plan, I know, but it is all I have." That evening, after Rebecca had left, I sat at my uncle's desk and wrote letters to genealogy services, to distant relatives, to anyone who might be able to help me trace the family tree and identify potential heirs. I had to find someone, had to ensure the bloodline continued. The renewal I had performed would buy time, but it would not last forever. In 70 or 80 years, another warden would need to perform the ritual, and if there was no one to do it, the seal would fail. The responses came slowly over the following months. Most of my distant relatives had no interest in hearing about obscure family history. A few responded with polite curiosity, but nothing useful. I was beginning to accept that I might be the last of the bloodline, that the Harrison watch might end with me. Then, in March of my second year, I received a letter that changed everything. It came from a rule firm in Portland, Oregon, and contained information about a second cousin I had never heard of. Marcus Harrison, 32 years old, had recently lost his wife in an accident and was raising his 5-year-old daughter alone. According to the genealogical research the law firm had conducted on my behalf, Marcus was a direct descendant of my great-great-grandfather's brother, making him part of the bloodline. I stared at the letter for a long time, trying to decide what to do. Should I contact Marcus, explain the situation, try to convince him to consider becoming the next warden? The idea seemed absurd. He had a young daughter, a life in Oregon. Why would he give all of that up to maintain a watch he probably did not even believe in? But I had to try. The alternative was letting the watch end with me, condemning future generations to face the consequences of a failed seal. I called the number the law firm had provided. A tired-sounding man answered on the fourth ring. "Hello, Marcus Harrison." "Yes, who is this?" "My name is William Harrison. We are cousins, though we have never met. I am calling about our family history, specifically about property in Maine that has been in our family for generations." There was a pause. "I did not know I had family in Maine. What kind of property?" "A lighthouse keeper's cottage in a place called Pinegrove Hollow. It is complicated. I would rather not explain over the phone. Would you be willing to meet? I could fly to Portland, or I could pay for you to visit Maine." Another pause, longer this time. "Is this some kind of inheritance thing? Because if you are trying to get me to invest in something, it is not a scam. I promise. This is about family responsibility, about something our ancestors started that needs to be continued. Please, Marcus, just give me one meeting, 1 hour of your time." Something in my voice must have convinced him, because he agreed. We set a date 2 weeks out, enough time for me to arrange for Rebecca to watch the cottage while I traveled. I spent those 2 weeks preparing, organizing documents and photographs, rehearsing how to explain the situation without sounding completely insane. When the day came, I flew to Portland with a folder full of evidence and a desperate hope that Marcus would understand. We met at a coffee shop near his apartment. Marcus was tall and lean, with the same dark hair and gray eyes that characterized the Harrison bloodline. His daughter Emma sat beside him, coloring in a book while we talked. I started with the facts: the cottage, the lighthouse, the history of wardens maintaining the property for generations. Marcus listened politely but skeptically. Then I showed him the journals, the photographs, the documented history of disappearances and strange occurrences around Pinegrove Hollow. "This is interesting family history," he said when I finished, "but I am not sure why you needed to fly across the country to tell me about it." "Because I need a successor. Someone from the bloodline who can take over the watch when I cannot continue. You and Emma are the only other members of the family I have been able to locate." Marcus's expression hardened. "Absolutely not. I am not moving to Maine, and I am certainly not dragging my daughter into whatever situation you are describing. I am not asking you to move immediately. I am asking you to consider it for the future, to learn about the watch, to understand what is at stake. What is at stake is that you are clearly disturbed and need help. Thank you for the family history, but I think we are done here." He stood up, gathering Emma's coloring supplies. I had one chance left to convince him. "The entities are real, Marcus. I know how it sounds, but they are real. And if there is no one to maintain the seal after I am gone, they will spread. They will reach Portland eventually, reach everywhere. Your daughter will grow up in a world where things like the walkers and scratchers roam freely." Marcus stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight. "Stay away from me and my daughter. If you contact us again, I will call the police." He left, Emma looking back at me with curious eyes as her father hurried her away. I sat alone in the coffee shop staring at the folder of documents, knowing I had failed. The flight back to Maine was long and depressing. I had no heir, no successor, no plan for what would happen when my time as warden ended. Rebecca was waiting at the cottage when I arrived, and I told her what had happened. "He will come around," she said, though she did not sound convinced. "Give him time to process. People need time to accept extraordinary truths. He thinks I am insane. He is not going to come around. Then you need to find another way. There has to be someone else in the family, someone who will listen." But months of searching had revealed no one else. Marcus and Emma were it. If they would not accept the burden, the watch would end with me. That night I sat in my uncle's chair and wrote a long entry in my journal, documenting my failure to secure a successor. I wrote about my fears for what would happen after I was gone, about the weight of knowing I might be the last warden. I wrote about how the seal would hold for decades after my death, thanks to the renewal ritual, but would eventually fail without someone to maintain it. "If you are reading this," I wrote, addressing some unknown future reader, "then I have failed. The watch has ended and you are likely dealing with the consequences. I am sorry. I tried to find someone to continue, tried to pass on the knowledge and the duty, but the bloodline had narrowed too much. There were not enough of us left. The seal will hold for a time without a warden, 70 years, maybe 80 if conditions are favorable, but it will fail eventually. When it does, you will know. The entities will spread from Pinegrove Hollow like a plague, moving along the coast, seeking new territories. You will see disappearances, strange lights, hear voices that should not exist. The signs will be unmistakable. There is no easy solution. The seal cannot be rebuilt without warden's blood, without someone willing to bind themselves to the hollow as my ancestors did. But perhaps you will find another way. Perhaps the accumulated knowledge in these journals will give you the tools to contain the entities differently, to create new barriers that do not require a hereditary guardian. I hope so. I hope my failure does not doom countless innocents to face what I have faced here. But if it does, know that I tried. I gave everything I had to maintain the watch for as long as possible. I closed the journal and sat staring into the fire, feeling the weight of my inadequacy. 29 years old, and I had already failed at the most important task of my life. The next morning, Margaret called with unexpected news. "There is someone here who wants to meet you," she said. She showed up at my house this morning asking about the cottage, about you, about Pinegrove Hollow. "Who is she?" "She says her name is Elena Morrison, and she is a researcher studying coastal folklore and disappearances. But William, there is something about her. She knows too much. She is not just a researcher. Bring her here. If she knows about the Hollow, I need to find out how much and why. An hour later, Margaret arrived with a woman in her 40s, dressed in practical outdoor clothes and carrying a worn leather satchel. Elena Morrison had sharp features, intelligent eyes, and an air of competence that reminded me of Margaret herself. "Thank you for seeing me," Elena said as she sat in the living room. "I know this is unusual, and I will understand if you want me to leave after you hear what I have to say. But I need to talk to you about what you are doing here. What do you think I am doing here, maintaining a supernatural seal that keeps extremely dangerous entities confined to this stretch of coastline? You are the warden, heir to a family tradition that goes back 6 generations, and from what I have observed, you are very good at it." I glanced at Margaret, who looked as surprised as I felt. "How do you know all of this?" Elena opened her satchel and pulled out a notebook filled with detailed observations. "I have been studying sites like Pinegrove Hollow for 15 years, places where the barrier between our world and others has worn thin, where entities that should not exist have found purchase in our reality. There are dozens of such sites scattered across the country, and most of them have guardians like you, people who maintain seals or perform rituals or simply keep watch over the dangerous places. I have documented 12 active sites, interviewed 7 guardians, and studied the historical records of another 20 sites that failed when their guardians died or abandoned their posts. Pinegrove Hollow is one of the oldest and most stable seals I have encountered. Your family has done remarkable work here. You believe in all of this?" I asked, still trying to process what she was telling me. Belief is not the right word. I have seen too much to operate on belief. I know these places are real. I know the entities are real. I know the guardians who maintain the barriers are performing an essential service that the rest of the world does not even realize is necessary. "Why are you studying this?" Elena's expression grew somber. "Because the seals are failing. All of them, everywhere, are weakening at an accelerating rate. Sites that were stable for centuries are suddenly developing cracks in their barriers. Guardians are reporting increased entity activity, more violent assaults, more desperate attempts to break through. Something fundamental is changing, and I am trying to understand what before it is too late." The 3 of us talked for hours. Elena showed me her research, her documentation of other sites and other guardians. Each site was unique, different types of entities, different sealing methods, different traditions, but they all shared common patterns, and those patterns were shifting in disturbing ways. "The astronomical alignments are changing," Elena explained, pointing to charts in her notebook. "Nothing dramatic, nothing that would be noticeable to casual observers, but enough to affect the seals. Most of these barriers were created during specific celestial configurations, and as those configurations drift over time, the seals weaken. Your renewal ritual helped, but it is a temporary fix. The underlying problem remains. In 50 years, maybe less, every major seal in the country will be compromised, and there are not enough guardians to maintain them all. What can we do?" Margaret asked. "I do not know yet. That is why I am documenting everything, trying to find patterns, trying to understand the underlying mechanics. If we can figure out what is causing the acceleration, maybe we can find a way to counteract it. But I need help. I need access to sites like this one, need to study active seals and talk to experienced guardians." I thought about what she was proposing. Opening Pinegrove Hollow to an outsider, sharing the accumulated knowledge of 6 generations, went against every instinct my uncle had instilled in me. The watch was meant to be kept secret, isolated, known only to the guardian and a few trusted locals. But if Elena was right, if all the seals were failing, then secrecy would not save us. We needed to understand what was happening and find solutions before the barriers collapsed completely. "You can study Pinegrove Hollow," I said finally. "You can examine the seal, read the journals, observe the entities. But you have to follow the rules absolutely. No exceptions, no experiments that might weaken the barriers." Elena nodded seriously. "I understand. And thank you. This could be the key to understanding the broader pattern." She stayed at Margaret's house but visited the cottage daily for the next month. She examined everything: the lighthouse, the iron chain barriers, the tide pools, the well. She read through all the journals, took detailed notes on the rules and their implementation, and observed the nightly entity activity from the safety of the cottage. She also brought new insights. Having studied multiple sites, she could identify patterns I had missed. The 7 rules, she explained, were not arbitrary. They corresponded to 7 different types of supernatural vulnerabilities, 7 ways the entities could exploit weaknesses in the seal. Each rule was designed to prevent a specific type of breach. "Your ancestors understood something that most guardians do not," she said one evening as we reviewed her findings. "They did not just create a barrier. They created a system, an ecology of containment that balanced multiple opposing forces. The rules are not for you. They are rules for the seal itself, constraints that keep it stable. So what happens when someone breaks a rule? You destabilize one part of the system. The seal compensates, drawing power from other parts to reinforce the weakened section, but that compensation has a cost. Break too many rules too often and the entire system collapses under the strain. That explained why my early mistakes had such severe consequences. Every violation had forced the seal to adapt, had depleted its reserves of power. The renewal ritual had restored those reserves, but I needed to be more careful going forward." Elena's most disturbing discovery came from comparing Pinegrove Hollow to the other sites she had studied. "The entities here are more organized than at most locations," she said. "At other sites, the things beyond the barriers are chaotic, random in their attacks. But here they coordinate, they plan. They learn from each attempt and adapt their strategy." "The Keeper," I said. "It seems to coordinate the others." "Exactly. And that is unusual. Most sealed sites do not have a central intelligence directing the entities. They are just collections of dangerous things locked away together. But Pinegrove Hollow has hierarchy structure. That makes it more dangerous but also more stable in some ways. The Keeper understands the seal, respects its power even while testing it. Is that good or bad? I am not sure yet, but it is different. And different might be important." After a month, Elena left to continue her research at other sites, but she promised to return with any new discoveries. She also gave me contact information for 3 other guardians, people maintaining seals at different locations who might be willing to share information. "You are not alone," she said as she prepared to leave. "There are others fighting the same battle you are, even if you have never met them. We need to start connecting these isolated guardians, sharing knowledge, supporting each other." The old tradition of secrecy made sense when the seals were stable, but times have changed. We need to adapt. After Elena left, I felt simultaneously encouraged and terrified. Encouraged because I was not alone, because there were others who understood and could help. Terrified because if every seal was weakening, then the problem was far larger than Pinegrove Hollow, far more dangerous than I had imagined. I contacted the other guardians Elena had mentioned. One was a woman in Louisiana maintaining a seal over a swamp where things older than the Hollow had been bound. Another was a man in Montana watching over a cave system that connected to places that should not exist. The third was a teenage boy in Arizona who had inherited a watch over a desert site where the veil between worlds was tissue thin. We started sharing information, comparing notes on entity behavior, discussing methods and techniques. It helped to know there were others, to have a network of people who understood the weight of the watch and the cost of maintaining it. Through these connections, I learned about other renewal rituals, different ways of strengthening seals that did not require hereditary blood. Some sites used astronomical events, others used sacrifices of animals or objects with symbolic significance. Each guardian had developed unique methods based on their particular situation. One guardian, a woman named Patricia who maintained a seal in Vermont, had found a way to extend the life of her seal without permanently binding herself to it. She had discovered that the seal could draw power from the land itself if properly anchored, reducing the need for constant guardian intervention. "It is not perfect," she explained over the phone. "The seal still needs a guardian, still requires someone to maintain the physical barriers and perform the basic rituals. But it does not consume the guardian the way your renewal did. You can leave if necessary, take breaks, live a relatively normal life while still fulfilling your duties." Could that technique work here? Maybe. Every site is different. You would need to experiment carefully. Make sure any changes do not weaken the existing seal, but it might be worth trying. I spent the next several months researching Patricia's method, adapting it to Pinegrove Hollow's specific conditions. Rebecca helped with the experiments, and together we slowly modified the seal, creating anchors that drew power from the bedrock beneath the cottage, from the iron in the lighthouse, from the ocean itself. The changes were subtle at first. The nightly entity activity decreased slightly. The strain I felt through my connection to the seal lessened. I found I could sleep deeper, could leave the property for short trips without feeling the pullback as intensely. By the time I reached my 3rd anniversary at Pinegrove Hollow, the modifications were complete. The seal was still strong, still effective, but no longer entirely dependent on my constant presence. I was still the warden, still bound to this place, but with more freedom than I had thought possible. I celebrated my 30th birthday quietly, with Rebecca and Margaret joining me for dinner at the cottage. We ate and talked about ordinary things, carefully avoiding the subject of the watch for one evening. It felt good to pretend, even briefly, that I was just a normal person living a normal life. That illusion shattered 2 weeks later when Marcus Harrison appeared at my door. He looked older than when I had seen him in Portland, haggard and frightened. Emma stood beside him, clutching a stuffed animal and looking around with wide eyes. "They followed us," Marcus said without preamble. "The things you warned me about. They followed us home." I pulled them inside quickly, closing and locking the door. "What happened?" 3 nights ago, Emma started seeing things. Shadows that moved wrong, figures at the windows. I thought she was having nightmares, trauma from losing her mother. But then I saw them too, and I remembered what you said about the entities spreading if the watch failed. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was not real. But last night, one of them spoke to me. It used my wife's voice, called me from outside. I almost opened the door. I almost let it in. That is when I knew I needed help. I examined Emma, who watched me with those intelligent Harrison eyes. She had the sight, I realized. She could perceive the supernatural naturally, the way Rebecca could. And that sensitivity had made her a beacon, had drawn the attention of something that had escaped Pinegrove Hollow. "How did they follow you from here?" I asked. "The seal should have kept them contained. I do not think they followed me from here. I think they found me because of the bloodline. You said I was family, that the Harrison blood meant something. Maybe that connection works both ways. Maybe they can sense us, track us." It was a disturbing thought. If entities could locate members of the bloodline, then Marcus and Emma would never be safe. Not unless the seal at Pinegrove Hollow was strengthened enough to completely sever that connection. "You need to stay here," I said. "The barriers will protect you, and I need to figure out what is happening, why the entities can reach you across 3,000 miles. Marcus looked around the cottage, at the iron bells and protective symbols, at the careful arrangements that kept the darkness at bay. "This is real, is it not? Everything you told me, all of it is true?" "Yes." He sank onto the couch, his face in his hands. "I am sorry. I should have listened. I should have believed you. You are here now. That is what matters." I set them up in the upstairs bedroom and then called Elena. She arrived 2 days later, bringing equipment and expertise. Together we examined the situation, trying to understand how an entity had broken free of the hollow and tracked Marcus to Oregon. What we discovered was worse than I had feared. The modifications I had made to the seal, the anchors I had created to reduce my burden, had created a small gap. Not enough to let the major entities through, but enough for something smaller and cleverer to slip out. One of the scratchers had escaped, had followed the connection it sensed to Marcus, and was now stalking him. "We need to retrieve it," Elena said. "If it stays loose, it will attract others. 1 entity free is manageable. 12 is a disaster. How do we retrieve it? It is 3,000 miles away. The bloodline connection works both ways. If it used that connection to find Marcus, we can use it to call the entity back. But it will require Marcus's cooperation, and it will not be pleasant." Marcus agreed immediately. "Whatever it takes. I cannot have that thing near my daughter." The ritual Elena designed was complex and unpleasant. It required Marcus to cut his palm and let his blood drip onto a map of the country while speaking words that would activate the bloodline connection. The entity, drawn by the fresh blood of its prey, would feel compelled to return to the source of the call. We performed the ritual at sunset, with all the protections of the cottage active. Marcus spoke the words Elena had taught him, his blood falling onto the map, creating a trail from Oregon to Maine. Through my connection to the seal, I felt something respond, felt a distant presence suddenly racing toward us with terrifying speed. "It is coming," I said. "Everyone inside, away from the windows." The scratcher arrived 3 hours later, moving faster than should have been possible across 3,000 miles. It threw itself at the barriers with desperate fury, Having been free for days and now being pulled back into captivity, I let it exhaust itself against the defenses, then used a technique Patricia had taught me to create a temporary opening in the seal. The scratcher lunged through the gap, and I sealed it behind the entity immediately. It shrieked in rage at being recaptured, but the seal held. The escaped prisoner was back where it belonged. Marcus watched all of this with a mixture of horror and acceptance. When it was over, he turned to me and said, "Teach me. I want to learn. Emma and I cannot go back to Oregon, not with these things able to track us. If we have to be here, then I want to understand. I want to help." And so I gained not just an apprentice, but an heir. Marcus and Emma moved into the cottage permanently. I taught Marcus everything I knew about the watch, about the entities, about the methods of containment, and the history of our family's duty. He learned quickly, driven by the need to protect his daughter and by a growing understanding of how important this work was. Emma, meanwhile, learned from Rebecca. The two of them formed a bond, Rebecca teaching the young girl how to use her sight, how to sense entities without fear, how to understand the supernatural while maintaining her humanity. Watching them work together, I felt something I had not experienced in years: hope. The watch would continue. Marcus would take over when I could no longer maintain it, and Emma would eventually inherit from him. The Harrison line would endure, and with it the seal over Pinegrove Hollow. Elena visited regularly, continuing her research and helping us develop new techniques. Through her network of guardians, we learned that other sites were beginning to stabilize. The modifications we had developed at Pinegrove Hollow, the techniques for drawing power from the land itself, were being adapted to other seals. The crisis Elena had warned about was not over, but it was being managed. 4 years after inheriting the cottage, I stood on the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic and took stock of my life. I was 32 years old, permanently bound to a place most people did not even know existed. I had lost years of memories to the blood magic, had sacrificed any chance at a normal life, had condemned myself to an eternal vigil against darkness. But I had also found purpose. I had discovered strengths I never knew I possessed. I had built connections with people like Margaret, Rebecca, Elena, and Marcus who understood the weight of the extraordinary. And I had ensured that the watch would continue, that future generations would be protected from the things that prowled at the edges of reality. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, not the crimson of the red sky that brought the tall figure from the cornfields, but a natural sunset, beautiful and ordinary. I watched it descend toward the horizon, then turned and walked back to the cottage where Marcus and Rebecca were preparing dinner, and Emma was doing homework at the kitchen table. Inside, I rang the bells to mark the transition from day to night. 3 times at each door and window, the clear sound cutting through the evening air, the ritual I would perform every night for the rest of my life, the duty I had inherited and would eventually pass on. Outside, the entities began their nightly movements. The walkers emerged from the forest, testing the boundaries. The scratchers circled the cottage looking for weaknesses that did not exist. From the lighthouse came the green glow of the keeper, and from the well the sounds of something climbing eternally upward, all contained, all controlled, the seal holding firm against the darkness. I sat down at the kitchen table with my family, not family by blood alone, but by shared purpose and mutual understanding, and began to eat. Tomorrow I would check the barriers, would maintain the physical structures, would continue the endless work of the watch. But tonight, in this moment, I allowed myself to simply be. To exist in the space between sunset and deep night, when the bells had been rung but the true darkness had not yet fallen. A space of relative safety, of community, of continuation. The watch would go on. The Harrison duty would endure, and Pinegrove Hollow would remain sealed, its inhabitants bound by rules older than memory, guarded by wardens who understood that some burdens must be carried regardless of cost. I had become the seal, as my great-great-grandfather had warned. I was no longer entirely William, entirely human. I was the warden, bound to this place, to these entities, to this duty until my death, and I had made my peace with that. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, patient and eternal. Inside, the lights burned bright, pushing back the shadows, maintaining the small island of safety we had created. The bells hung silent above the doors, ready to be rung again at sunrise. 7 rules to survive, 7 boundaries to maintain, 7 ways to keep the darkness at bay. I had learned them. I had followed them. I had paid the price for my mistakes and emerged stronger for it. And tomorrow I would teach Marcus the final lessons, would begin the process of transferring the watch to the next generation. The cycle would continue as it had for 6 generations before me, as it would for generations after. This was my inheritance. This was my burden. This was my life. The Warden's testament, written in blood and sacrifice, bound in duty and purpose, sealed with the weight of generations, and the watch continues.